Good morning. My name is Seth Letterman. I'm the CEO of Tonix Pharmaceuticals. And I'm grateful to you for coming to see the presentation. I'm grateful to the organizers for having us speak. Today I've got a lot to say. I'm going to try to fit it into the time we have. We have some exciting new analyses that have never been presented before about long COVID, which is one of our programs. And I'm going to talk about the relationship of long COVID to fibromyalgia, which is another condition which Tonix has a program in. But first let me take a breath and say Tonix is a public company. We're traded on NASDAQ under the ticker TNXP. And I will be making forward-looking statements, and I'll refer you to our SEC documents for more complete information about the company. One of the most distinctive things about Tonix is the broad portfolio of products that we have in development. So we have an engine of discovery, manufacturing, regulatory, clinical development, and other things. And that's why it's been efficient and interesting for us to acquire a number of different programs. And we have, therefore, a rich pipeline and a lot of news coming out. So here's listed the central nervous system portfolio drugs. And I'm going to be talking today in particular about the top one, TNX-102SL, and particularly the indications of fibromyalgia and long COVID. So that's going to occupy most of my talk. I will, before the end of the talk, just give you a few highlights on three other programs in our central nervous system portfolio, and that's the cocaine antidote, TNX-1300, the migraine drug, TNX-1900, and the antidepressant program, TNX-601CR. But most of the time I'm going to speak about fibromyalgia and long COVID. We also have a biologic in development for transplantation, organ transplantation and treatment of autoimmune disease. And then we have a pretty extensive infectious disease portfolio, a number of programs in COVID. I'm not going to have time to talk about those today. And finally, we have a rare disease drug in development with FDA orphan designation. This is TNX-2900 for Prader-Willi. Anyway, let me get back to our central nervous system drugs. And as I said, we're going to speak mostly about fibromyalgia and long COVID and present some information that's never been presented before about long COVID. So first, let me tell you about fibromyalgia. First of all, I'm a physician and a rheumatologist. I was a professor at Columbia Medical School for many years. And in that capacity, I've had firsthand experience with fibromyalgia, and I've been interested in it for over 30 years. Fibromyalgia is a syndrome. It's called a pain syndrome. The patients hurt all over their body. That's called multi-site pain. And we have been developing a medicine called TNX-102SL, which is a sublingual tablet, an under-the-tongue tablet, rapidly disintegrates under the tongue and releases medicine into the bloodstream. That medicine is cyclobenzaprine. Our treatment paradigm is that by taking this medicine every night for a long number of nights, a chronic therapy, you can improve sleep quality, and that we believe improved sleep quality then trickles down and results in improvement in some of the other symptoms. And I'll show you, we have a positive phase 3 study in this program, and we just started another. Now, we also recently announced that we had a missed phase 3 study, so I'm going to tell you about that. So the phase 3 study called Resilient, F307, has just started enrolling. So this is very exciting. We're going to have interim results in the first quarter of 2023, so that's less than 1 year away. The phase 3 study called Rally, we recently announced top-line results, and in that one we missed. And let me give you some ideas about why we missed and why we're still very excited about the program. So first, this compares Rally against Relief. Relief was a positive phase 3 study, and in this slide you can see that both the placebo and the drug groups had an increase in dropouts. That's what we call adverse event-related discontinuations. So if you look on the left, placebo went from 3.5 to 6.2, and the drug-treated group went from 8.5 to 15.2. This is very unusual because obviously the people getting placebo are getting placebo. So we think it's unusual that in both groups there was a higher number of dropouts. And as you can see on this slide, it's a little bit of a busy slide, but I'll just show you the critical thing. The FDA now requires a treatment for missing data called multiple imputation, or MI. And if you look at the top is the Raleigh results with and without the statistical treatment called MI. And with MI, which is the column, Raleigh is at the top, MMRM, MI, and if you look at the p-values, you see that we missed when we did the missing data treatment. But if you look at the right column, you can see that without the missing data treatment, the p-value for the primary endpoint would have been 0.014, which is strongly positive. So I think that this illustrates how the new standard of FDA to require a treatment for missing data has increased the threshold for making a study positive. For example, the 3 approved drugs in fibromyalgia were approved before FDA introduced the requirement to use multiple imputation or other methods to treat missing data. So in the old criteria, this might have been a positive study. But you can see in the bottom, the Raleigh study succeeded whether or not we use missing data. And I'm just highlighting this to show you that we believe there was something about enrolling the study and conducting the study during the particular phase of the pandemic that we did that somehow made people more likely to drop out of the study. And it happened in both drug and placebo. Interestingly, in both cases, the dropouts increased by 80% relative to our experience. So we're confident about the tolerability of the drug. We're confident about the activity of the drug. As you see here, without the missing data, we had good activity. So that's why we're starting the new study. And we think that now that we're further along in the pandemic, that things should normalize. That's the expectation. By the way, the first positive phase 3 study was also conducted during the pandemic, but that was a different phase in the pandemic where for the most part people hadn't been vaccinated and they were staying home. Second part of the pandemic, people were getting vaccinated. There was a lot of, I think in some ways it was a very different phase of the pandemic. So we're excited about the new study. But now I want to change gears a little bit. Fibromyalgia is one of a group of conditions called chronic overlapping pain conditions, COPC. And I'm leading you into this to give you an idea about why we're so enthusiastic about our long COVID program. So on this list of conditions, fibromyalgia, irritable bowel, number of other things, there is not yet listed long COVID. But we think that long COVID, or a significant number of long COVID patients, fall into this group of conditions. So one of the things that is believed about fibromyalgia is that many people contract fibromyalgia after an illness like a viral illness. And there's been a lot of speculation over the years that fibromyalgia was a post-viral condition. And there was no good data on it, but we also didn't have an experiment like something like COVID that would sweep through the world and infect so many people and leave people with this syndrome called long COVID. After the pandemic, or in the pandemic, we're still in the pandemic, there's also been a nationwide and probably a worldwide increase in myalgia, which is pain, muscle aches and pains. And we don't really understand it, but we think that the myalgia is related to to COVID, whether someone has had it or not. It's just created a lot of anxiety, social isolation, all these other kind of problems. So there is a backdrop of more symptoms in people. Now, let me just back up and tell you about how the experts view pain. There are now 3 kinds of pain that are recognized. nociceptive, and that means, for example, if you stub your toe, if you hit the leg of a chair in the middle of the night and you stub your toe and you hurt, that's nociceptive pain. That's the most common pain. That's what people think about generally when they think about pain. Another kind of pain is neuropathic pain, and that's, for example, if you have a disc compression hitting a nerve. So the most classic one would be sciatica, where you actually have a vertebrate leaning on a nerve, and that leads to pain radiating down your leg. The third kind of pain, nociceptive pain, has been recognized for a long time, but the term nociceptive is relatively new. And nociceptive pain is pain that originates in the brain. And that's what people believe fibromyalgia is an example of, pain that originates in the brain. So what happens in the brain? It's probably that, or the leading mechanistic belief is that the brain has a threshold for sensing pain, and in people with fibromyalgia and other kinds of nociplastic pain, the threshold is set too low so that any kind of stimulus that wouldn't bother a normal, healthy, non-fibromyalgia person bothers a fibromyalgia person. And that's shown in this graph here, where you have the stimulus intensity for causing pain is shifted over. So it's called central sensitization. Central means the brain. Sensitization means the brain's perception of pain. So people with fibromyalgia experience pain at the same level of irritation that would not trigger a pain response in someone without fibromyalgia. Central sensitization, which is the underlying basis of nociplastic pain, happens in a number of conditions, but it's severe in those on the right, that tension type headache, migraine, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, myalgic encephalomyelitis, these kinds of things are on the right, where there's a lot of this problem. So now we turn to long COVID. So long COVID is a heterogeneous condition. That means there are many different kinds of long COVID. But in a large number of people, there is a big element of nociplastic pain. And what do I mean? Well, if you look at the surveys or what everyone has found about long COVID patients, the majority of them have a constellation of symptoms like multi-site pain, memory issues, that's called brain fog, colloquially, fatigue, and sleep disturbance. So these four symptoms that are the most common symptoms of long COVID are also symptoms of fibromyalgia. So that's why when we look at long COVID, we think of fibromyalgia-like, so that's fibromyalgia hyphenated, like long COVID. And our conception, and I think most experts' conception, is that long COVID starts, and here in this figure it's called PASC, P-A-S-C. That's the official name of long COVID that very few people use. It stands for post-acute sequelae of COVID-19. But if you see here, the virus comes and goes, and then long COVID happens in the aftermath. And here's another time course that is important for thinking about when you see the next slides, is many people, 50% of people, after they recover from COVID, have symptoms of long COVID. But by 60 days after long COVID, it's down to about 35% of patients. And that's the number that you usually see. And for most people, the definition of long COVID doesn't really start until you've been out for at least 30 days, but usually 60 days. So long COVID is common, and it's also growing because people can get long COVID whether or not they're vaccinated. They can get long COVID whether or not they've successfully recovered from COVID without getting long COVID in the past. So here's a published paper from another group, not connected to us, showing that about 70% of long COVID patients have this central sensitization. Remember, the brain has an increased sensitivity to pain and these other symptoms. So about 70% of long COVID patients fall in this group, generally speaking, of fibromyalgia-like long COVID. And remember, this is data that is not, this was done by a third party we had no connection with. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is we took a look at long COVID in a large database. This is U.S. patients, but it's a computer, an electronic database. It's a retrospective analysis. This database called TriNetX starts with 75 million people, and then you go through different filters. 1 million people in the database at least reported or were treated for COVID, and are adults, by the way. We just looked at adults. And then there's another big cut when we look at, we just want people for whom there was an encounter with a healthcare professional 180 days after reporting COVID. Because if we're looking for long COVID, we need to catch that window. So we can't look too soon because they haven't had time to figure out if they have it or if they've had it long enough. So what we found is out of, there were 260,000 people who fit that criteria, and of those, 52,000 had long COVID. So that's a rate that's somewhere very roughly 20%. So it's lower than the numbers that have been reported in other studies, which is 33%. But because of the issues in doing a retrospective analysis of a large database like this, we think 20% is basically in the same range as 30%, at least with respect to that. So I think that we have a good look at long COVID, the same long COVID that other people are talking about. And then we also looked at pain. And it's a particular type of pain, and remember, nociplastic pain. And nociplastic pain is not like you stubbed your toe in the middle of the night and your toe hurts. Multi-site pain means you hurt all over your body, basically everywhere in your body. If you ask a fibromyalgia patient, sometimes you go, is there any place where you don't hurt? And sometimes they'll touch their nose. That's how, so it's the whole body hurts, but it's called multi-site pain. So we looked at this group of 50,000 people and asked how many had multi-site pain, and we found that it was over 40%. So 41% of people fell into this, and you'll see in this dark blue thing, in the light blue on the left, you'll see the multi-site pain group, but then on the right you'll see that 80% of them just had multi-site pain, and then there was about a quarter of them had a constellation of insomnia and fatigue. In this particular analysis, we couldn't find a way to look at brain fog because there just didn't seem to be a diagnostic criteria that was recorded in these encounters. But these are 3 of the 4 symptoms. So this is very important for us because we're about to start a study in long COVID, and we're going to enroll people with multi-site pain, and our primary endpoint is an improvement in multi-site pain. So it's very encouraging to us from a feasibility standpoint that 40% of long COVID patients appear to meet our criteria for enrollment in the study. We found something else very interesting in this study, and that's the use of other medicines. If you look in the middle of this, you'll see the use of opiates in people with long COVID. Long COVID patients without multi-site pain had 18% use in opiates. Long COVID patients with multi-site pain had 34% incidence. Actually, it was 36% across all the groups. But for multi-site pain only, it was 34%. But you can see in this bar, in the bar graph in the middle, the very light one with 50%, 50.1, that's people who had multi-site pain and insomnia. And 51.1 was people that had insomnia and fatigue. So these are frightening levels of opiate usage. And I'm sure everyone knows we're just working our way out of an opiate crisis. But now with long COVID emerging as a quite common condition, I mean, growing at an alarming rate, you can see that there's a lot of opiate use in this group. And as far as I know, this is the first time that this has been reported by anyone. You can see on the left panel that benzodiazepines seemed relatively similar, but they were more correlated with, it appears they were more correlated with people that had insomnia, which makes sense because insomnia is something that leads people to take benzodiazepines, which is another class of medicines with some health concerns connected with it. But you can see on the right panel, the antidepressant use seemed to be quite different. As a matter of fact, people with multi-site pain looked like they took somewhat less antidepressants than people that didn't have multi-site pain. So this is really something to follow because given the growing incidence of long COVID, there's a real concern that we'll have some of these people become dependent on opiates. And you can see on the left panel that the Labor Department estimates that 1 in 4 people prescribed opiates begin to struggle with opiate addiction. This is just some general bullet points about the astonishing cost of long COVID. 25% of people are believed not to be able to go back to work. And here's some statistics from the United Kingdom talking about the huge economic burden to the healthcare system. President Biden just last week on April 5th announced in an executive memorandum a number of things, but really responding to the growing long COVID crisis, he is setting up a government-wide response, which is the first ever full coordination of all government agencies with private agencies and a national action plan to address this growing healthcare crisis. So I hope you can understand now why we're developing TNX-102SL for long COVID. As I mentioned, we already have a positive phase 3 study in fibromyalgia, and the primary endpoint in fibromyalgia is a reduction in multi-site pain. So that's why we've met with FDA, discussed this. We now have a cleared IND. We're going to start this study in long COVID patients with multi-site pain. We refer to it as fibromyalgia-like long COVID. But we really think that we're a leader in this. We're ahead of other people, and it's because we've been working in fibromyalgia for a number of years that gave us a leg up in this. Okay, now I'm just going to very quickly tell you about 3 other CNS programs. The first, this is an antidote for cocaine intoxication. It's a biologic. It's injected intravenously. It has FDA breakthrough therapy designation. Cocaine intoxication, the colloquial term is overdose, but there's no regular dose for cocaine. But it's a growing problem in the United States connected with many deaths in the emergency room and other severe morbidity and mortality. We have a cleared IND, as I said, FDA breakthrough therapy designation, and we have a phase 2 study that's imminently ready to begin. This has already been in a positive phase 2 study. In migraine, we have an intranasal oxytocin. This is injected in the nose. It interacts with neurons in the trigeminal ganglia. It's some very exciting stuff. The oxytocin, we have combined it in a formulation with magnesium. It used to be hard for us to explain why we have magnesium in our formulation. There was some good science behind it, obviously, but now, very recently, the atomic structure of oxytocin binding to the oxytocin receptor has been published. And as you can see here in red, magnesium is right at the middle. That's why we have magnesium. And then finally, TNX-601 is our depression program. This is tianeptine. It's a drug that's already approved in other countries around the world. We have a new formulation. It'll be the first time ever a prescription drug format for tianeptine will be available in the United States. So I'm going to quickly wrap up. A company like us with a wide pipeline has a lot of news coming up. We're on NASDAQ, as I said. Last time we reported cash, we had $180 million in cash. We have no debt, so a simple balance sheet. And we also have a simple cap structure. It's almost all common stock. We have no preferred stock and just a sliver, less than 0.2% of warrants from old deals. So very exciting time for Tonix, and I'm glad to be able to present to you the data on long COVID for the first time ever today, and to talk about how it explain to you why we think there's a connection to fibromyalgia and why our program is, we think, a real leader in the field. So thank you very much for your attention, and I think that I have used my allotment of time. I'm looking at so there won't be an opportunity to ask questions when I'm on the podium, but I'm happy to meet you outside. Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers.